Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to this session of the conference. We are being recorded for posterity or other. And our theme this morning is Entre, guerre et paix, mobilisation et démobilisation culturelle, 1914-1950. I'm John Horn from Trinity College, Dublin, and it's my great pleasure and honor to chair these proceedings. I'll very briefly introduce each of our speakers and our commentator. They will have, I think, 20 minutes each, and that should allow us a good half an hour for discussions afterwards. At the point of discussions, everybody will come to the front. The first paper will be given by Tomas from Trinity College, Dublin, who did his PhD in Trinity and is now a fellow, a postdoctoral fellow at the college, writing the history of the college during the years of the war and the Irish Revolution. His PhD was on universities in the era of the First World War. Then Marie-Ève Chagnon, who did her PhD at the Concordia University and is currently an FQRSC postdoctoral fellow in the Centre d'études allemandes et européennes at the Université de Montréal. And then Guillaume MARCEAU will complete the trio of papers. Guillaume is currently completing his PhD thesis at Concordia University in Montreal. And each of them are speaking on aspects of mobilization and cultural demobilization as a scientific, intellectual and university process during the First World War. So what we're really talking about this morning is the mobilization and the demobilization of knowledge in the context of the Great War. And Andrew BARROS from the Université du Québec à Montréal, where he's professor of history and a specialist in international relations in the 1920s, in the impact of the war on France and Germany, will then give the commentary. So I'd like to call on Tomas to deliver the first paper. Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. The decade before the First World War witnessed the creation of a multitude of international scholarly connections through the foundation of international learned societies and journals, international conferences, the establishment of professorial exchanges between universities, and the strengthening of international scholarly networks in which ideas and publications freely circulated. This was part of a broader phenomenon in which the world became increasingly connected. In this era of increasing national rivalry, education became a useful tool for the production of a positive image of the nation state. And there's no better practitioner of this sort of cultural diplomacy than Germany, widely known then as home to the greatest research universities in the world and a magnet for graduate students in other countries, especially the United States and Great Britain. The French Republic, born of France's defeat to Germany in 1870, made education central to the inculcation of a republican national identity and eyed German educational dominance jealously. Thus, there was an uneasy interplay between national rivalry and international education, and the desire that greater international scholarly exchange might help ensure peace as international tensions escalated from the turn of the century. American universities, being independent of federal control, were free to conduct their own foreign policy, and their interests often overlapped with those of the European states with whom they dealt. To take an example, in 1905, the Kaiser Wilhelm Roosevelt Professorial Exchange was founded at Columbia University, negotiated directly between the politically ambitious president of Columbia, Nicholas Murray Butler, and Kaiser Wilhelm II. These exchanges were prestigious for the nations, for the universities, and for the professors concerned. And soon other universities followed suit. Harvard University pursued a similar path, establishing professorial exchanges with both France and Germany. And that's what I'll be speaking about today. Harvard finalized its exchange with the Sorbonne in 1910. This was negotiated directly between the president of Harvard, Abbot Lawrence Lowell, and Louis Liard, the vice-rector of the Academy of Paris and the former Minister of Public Instruction. In a letter of September 1910, Lowell clearly laid out what Harvard sought to get out of the arrangement. He said, quote, "We feel that we have a great deal of stimulus to gain in this way, and that it will help us to keep in touch with the present rapid French intellectual movement from which we have much to learn. In this sense, our motive is selfish, but I also believe that ties of such a kind tend, by the fostering of national friendships and the removing of misapprehensions, to be of great value at such times when such ties are most needed. The Harvard-Sorbonne exchange was important because it was reciprocal. And as I am aware, the only reciprocal professorial exchange between the United States and France in this period. The point being that other universities had one-way exchanges, but this was reciprocal. Under its terms, a professor was sent from each institution for half a year, and the other institution would pay the salary of the visiting professor. At the same time, Harvard created a body called the Harvard Foundation, which sponsored American scholars who were already present overseas to lecture at the French provincial universities. The foundation funded lecturers to undertake tours of the provincial universities, spending up to 2 weeks at each and visiting not more than 4. Alternatively, they could give full courses at one university and give individual lectures elsewhere. As such, Harvard could benefit from the work of other university scholars and gain institutional prestige through the foundation. In practice, this meant that the university was also sending scholars, not necessarily its own, to both the Parisian intellectual elites as well as to the less internationally renowned institutions of the provinces. However, all would be significant sites and agents of mobilization in wartime. So what I want to speak about today is this particular network in wartime. I've spent a number of years tracing the development of transatlantic scholarly networks, identifying the processes through which scholars were instrumentalized as agents of the state in wartime, and how their actions were publicly presented by the media, by politicians, by university heads, and sometimes by the scholars themselves. And all this was sort of presented as a coherent message which tapped into the 18th century history of France and the United States, who were allied militarily from 1917. And this idea emerged that they were kindred intellectually as well as politically and militarily. And to date, I've been more interested in this larger process. But what I want to talk about today actually dates back to last year's French Historical Studies Conference, where I had the good fortune to discover extensive correspondence written by the professors who were part of the Harvard schemes. So my paper today will use this correspondence to examine the experiences of the scholars as they were used as agents of both the state and the university. And I'll argue that the motivations of these individuals for their travels were myriad, and quite often these men were unwitting agents of mobilization for war. The outbreak of the First World War showed how pre-existing scholarly connections could be leveraged by belligerents and demonstrated the motivations of the different participants in setting them up. The events of August 1914 split the international community of scholars, and expressions of outrage revolved around the German violation of Belgian neutrality and allegations of atrocities committed by the German army in Belgium. Scholars throughout the world felt especially strongly about the burning of the library at the University of Louvain, a cultural site seemingly without military or strategic importance. And the often bombastic denials and defence of the German army by German intellectuals exacerbated this sense of outrage and initiated a cultural war in which the German concept of Kultur was pitted against Western European notions of civilization. So in this context, pre-existing academic exchanges were energized as belligerents sought to win over neutral populations. This was especially pronounced at Columbia University in New York, where both France and Germany sent experts in international law to take up their respective visiting professorships in September 1914. Where they attempted to send experts in international law. But very quickly the mood in American universities had evolved against Germany. And indeed the German government felt that American elite opinion was already so hostile to their cause that by November 1914 they discontinued the professorial exchanges with Columbia and with Harvard University. At Harvard, there's traditionally a stronger German influence amongst the professoriate, and President Lowell did his utmost to ensure that this was not subsumed by growing Allied sympathy, by steadfastly defending academic freedom of speech amongst his professors. The French scholar of German, Henri Lichtenberger, took up a visiting position at Harvard in 1914-15. He was an Alsatian, born in 1864 at Mulhouse, educated at the Sorbonne and the University of Strasbourg, and appointed to a professorship at the former in 1905. His academic work had focused on the development of modern Germany, especially the works of Nietzsche and Wagner. He was chosen for this exchange the year before, and after much deliberation decided to continue with his plans to take up the post. As early as the 25th of August 1914, as the cultural atrocities at Louvain were taking place, Lowell wrote to Lichtenberger stating that, quote, "You will meet with the most friendly reception in America, for the feeling of sympathy with France is well nigh universal in what is being regarded as her struggle against the German military form of civilization." Before his arrival, Lichtenberger asked Lowell if there would be, quote, "any embarrassment amongst the German members of Harvard's faculty." Lowell assured him that "you need not fear in the slightest degree that your coming will produce any embarrassment." And on the same day, Lowell wrote to Liard in Paris to say that American sympathy was almost universally with the French. But Lichtenberger's experiences in Cambridge challenged the notion that the French professoriate was at once felt nothing but disdain and antipathy for their German counterparts, or that the scholarly world was immediately polarized in September and October of 1914. In his final letter before his departure for the US, he asked Lowell to communicate his best wishes to Professor Kuno Francke, Harvard's German professor of history and the curator of the university's Germanic Museum. When Lichtenberger was at Harvard, Francke was unable to attend a dinner given in his honor, but sent a statement expressing his regret at not being present, in which he outlined his sincere admiration for Lichtenberger's scholarship. Unlike some of his successors, Lichtenberger decided to stick rigidly to his agreed pre-war lecture schedule, avoiding overt reference to the war. In April 1915, he reported back to the French government that American rather than French voices would be the most effective means of mobilizing the American public. And he speculated on the likelihood of the US entering the war. It was much more important, he argued, that traveling French professors gave the impression of business as usual, that the war did not impact upon their work. Lichtenberger trod a very fine line. He seemed uncomfortable at taking on any additional responsibilities which were not within his usual scholarly remit. After all, to begin diatribes against German scholarship and thought would be to undermine his own vocation to an extent. At the same time, he had to justify this stance to his more bellicose colleagues in Paris. When Lichtenberger finished his visiting professorship, President Lowell wrote to Liard back in Paris praising his self-restraint. So the potential of academic exchanges soon became manifest to national governments as well as universities. Envisaged in peacetime as part of a process of extending cultural influence and exerting soft power, they were transformed in wartime as a means through which a certain narrative of the war and the values represented by France could be disseminated. French academics became agents of the state and the conduits for subtle cultural diplomacy, a policy advocated by the French ambassador to the United States, Jules Jusserand, and in keeping with Lichtenberger's experiences at Harvard. By May 1916, the Minister of Public Instruction, Paul Painlevé, was actively identifying scholars with the requisite linguistic and intellectual attainments to undertake missions in the United States. However, the importance of the Harvard exchange lay in its reciprocity. It was an exchange working in two directions, and it continued in this manner in wartime. These men, these American professors in France, were important too, both for their home institutions and as a symbol of a burgeoning alliance. The linguist Charles Grandgent was the Harvard exchange professor in Paris in 1915-16. Based on his experiences, he urged that his successor be a man with, quote, a great love of France, but also accurate knowledge of both American opinion and international relations, and who is capable of discussing them broadly and soundly with the eager members of this intelligent society. In wartime, the Harvard Foundation, set up to promote the work of an American university, was invigorated by the French government and utilized by the National Office for Universities to send lecturers to various provincial universities. In other words, the existing mechanism was mobilized in wartime to fulfill a new function, important simultaneously to the French government and to American institutions. But what of the scholars' experiences? Well, these men suddenly became people of great interest to the French public, and their activities were used as an opportunity to entrench a sense of cultural alliance. The Harvard philosopher James Woods was in France as the Harvard Foundation lecturer for 1915, but he actually stayed until 1918 as the official Harvard exchange professor to the Sorbonne, while also undertaking a number of tours of the provincial universities, giving lectures on William James and pragmatism. Woods enjoyed the attention, clearly, bestowed upon a representative of America in wartime France. In 1915, he was given a reception at the Sorbonne, of which he wrote that, quote, 51 members of the faculties were present, an indication of the cordial feeling towards Harvard in America. 2 big dinners with speeches and a déjeuner of 40. Better than this are the little family dinners with the man and wife and his children, the beginnings of durable friendship. So Woods enjoyed dining well, and making scholarly connections, which he felt were very beneficial to him on a personal level. Following the US entry into the war in 1917, he was touring the provincial universities, and he wrote of one of his lectures, quote, "After my conference there was a series of patriotic manifestations. The prefect and the general commanding the divisions were usually present at the conference or the dinner. Several times the mayor met me at the station. I addressed 2 big schools, and the scholars marched under our colours." The University of Clermont, in its annual report for 1917-18, recalled how in March 1918, Woods spoke at the largest theatre in the university, which was specially decked out in French and American flags for the occasion. Once more he spoke of the philosophy of William James, and the report noted that, quote, "It would not be inexact to say that, above all else, the desire to show French sympathy for the United States drew the elites from our town." Jesse Benedict Carter, a classicist and religious scholar and Harvard Foundation lecturer for 1917, had a similar experience. Lecturing in March 1917, just before the American entry into the war, on the humanity of America, he spoke to an average of 500 people in a tour that took him to Caen, Rouen, Nancy, Besançon, Dijon, Lyon, Grenoble, Marseille, and Paris. And on one instance, he addressed 1,200 people. Frequently, he recorded that his lectures were moved from the university to the Hotel de Ville. And at Rouen, he noted that all the notables of the town are present. While at Nancy, his lecture was made the occasion for a Franco-American fete. Altogether, he estimated that he had addressed 6,000 people, and noted that at a number of venues would be attendees were turned away. Carter felt he was doing more than just lecturing. He was a cultural ambassador for the United States. He said, quote, "It was a very rare privilege to be able to interpret the spirit of America to these stalwart and self-sacrificing souls who had been forced into the war without the slightest knowledge of who would be with them and who would be against them." More important, perhaps, was the westward shift in cultural power which came as a result of all of this. Woods noted in a letter of May 1917 that it is clear also that they, the French universities, are ready to learn from us, i.e. American scholars. A few months later he reported that, quote, "Our students make a good impression. The French count upon us as a nation of prophets who entered the war as saviours of the world. They will lean on us long after the war. What a responsibility and what a chance." America would soon be tied much more deeply into the university systems of Britain and France through the reciprocal exchange of students, professors and ideas. And this phenomenon was pushed equally by each party for differing reasons. The Harvard-Sorbonne exchange continued into the war, animated by the urgency of communicating French suffering to an important neutral audience. But the lecturers who took up these posts spoke of different things in their times there. The exchange professor for 1915-16 was Maurice Collery, the eminent zoologist and educationalist. His lectures of May 1916 focused not on his scholarly work but on educational opportunities for American students in France. And 2 years later he would write a book about his experiences in the United States, where he was very critical of governing structures in American universities. Increasingly, the exchange was not just between Harvard and the Sorbonne, but between suitable professors drawn from across a range of French universities. In 1916-17, Raoul Blanchard, a geographer from the University of Grenoble, was selected as the French exchange professor. At that point, the situation had changed. The United States was on the cusp of entering the war. And as such, the careful diplomacy advocated by Lichtenberger at the beginning of the war was dropped. Blanchard gave 6 lectures, all on the major battles of the war and on the tactical evolution in wartime. However, his personal experience of Harvard was far from happy after a car accident early in his stay. He viewed the overall experience negatively and returned home early. The American scholars in Europe also played an important role in helping decide who should come to lecture in the US. While the French government was keen to send the best possible scholars with the requisite qualifications, by this point the likely candidates had been subsumed by war work or by weariness. Woods reported that in 1970 that Bergson tells me he will come after the war. Durkheim is broken down in health. Lévy-Bruhl is mobilized. But Charles Sestre of Bordeaux is free and eager to return to Harvard. Charles Sestre had been identified by Painlevé as early as May 1916 as a scholar of potential use. His current institutional affiliation was at the University of Bordeaux, but he had lectured at Harvard before the war. In wartime, he had been mobilized into the postal control at Dieppe. but he was deemed important due to his knowledge of English literature and his fluency in English, and was appointed to Harvard as exchange professor in 1917-18. He was the final wartime lecturer at Harvard, but his experiences had led to a highly symbolic appointment thereafter. In late 1918, a chair in American civilization was established by the French Ministry of Education at the Sorbonne, the first of its sort in France. And Sestre was appointed the first chairholder, a symbolic continuation of wartime cultural politics. Interestingly, he had recently lost his son to the Spanish flu, and the new position helped him, in a way, deal with his grief. He wrote, quote, "Losing a son of 18 from that pest which the war brought in its wake is more cruel than giving him up for the country. But I take comfort in the new task ascribed to me at La Sorbonne, interpreting American civilization to France. It crowns all of my wishes. It is the attainment of all I have worked for, and which might not have been realized but for the momentous event that wrestled America to herself and to the world." So to conclude very quickly, the connection between Harvard and the French universities, and primarily the Sorbonne, is important because it allows us to focus on one exchange network, not only analysing its composition in wartime, but looking at the experience of the protagonists. Governments hope that these exchange professors would exert soft power, building consensus for the French cause in neutral America, thereafter bolstering the new alliance. On the other hand, the Harvard administration's desires never significantly changed. They remained eager to build institutional links abroad, a consequence of the space created by the absence of federal control of higher education in the United States, which allowed universities to pursue their own foreign policy. Either way, these men were expected to act in a political manner, either with an upper or lowercase p. The accounts of these men speak to a variety of motivations and experiences. It's certainly not true that all saw themselves as diplomats or as pseudo-diplomats. Clearly, Lichtenberger was caught off guard by the circumstances created by the outbreak of war and was uncomfortable with the pressures that came with it. He was uncomfortable being anything other than himself, a scholar of German. Meanwhile, Collier saw his mission in the United States as the extension of educational reform in France and an opportunity to disseminate knowledge of Republican educational achievements. Charles Sestre found solace in his new historic appointment, and he's not the only example you can find of someone who lost a son in the war, who took up an exchange position and found it provided a sort of solace. Meanwhile, the American scholars, while motivated by a vague sense of mission to create wider respect for American scholarship abroad, were generally, it seems, unwitting agents of French cultural mobilization for war. Thank you.